The year is 2006, Amarillo, Texas. The old farmhouse stands silent beneath an autumn sky, fields of golden wheat stretching toward the horizon like an endless blanket woven by time itself. Catherine Harrison Mitchell watches the hearse disappear down the dirt road, carrying away the last remains of her grandmother. Eleanor Harrison, 90 years old, has finally let go of this world, passing in her sleep with a face so peaceful it seems she had been waiting for this moment for 60 years. Catherine steps inside the quiet house. The smell of aged oak and dried lavender fills her lungs, a fragrance she has known since childhood. Her grandmother lived alone in this house for 40 years, ever since Grandpa Thomas died in 1958. A quiet life, almost hermit-like. She rarely spoke of the past, almost never mentioned her years in military service, and absolutely never discussed her time as a prisoner during the Second World War. The family knew only fragments. That she served as an officer in the Women's Army Corps, that she was captured by the Germans, that she was eventually liberated, nothing more. Whenever anyone asked for details, her gray-blue eyes would grow distant, and she would gently change the subject. Catherine climbs to the attic to begin sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. Afternoon sunlight streams through a small window, illuminating dust particles floating in the air like tiny golden spirits. She is moving an old trunk when her foot catches on a loose floorboard. The board pops up, revealing a hidden space beneath. Inside that space sits a tin box, rusted with age. Catherine lifts it carefully, heavier than expected. The small lock on the lid has corroded completely, and she breaks it easily. Inside, she finds a leather-bound journal worn soft by time, a stack of handwritten letters tied with faded red ribbon, and a purple heart medal that no one in the family ever knew existed. She opens the journal to the first page. Her grandmother's handwriting, trembling but clear, written in blue ink that has faded with the decades. If someone is reading these words, it means I am dead, and the truth can finally be told. My name is Eleanor Harrison, First Lieutenant, United States Women's Army Corps, service number A742893. In 1943, I was captured by German forces. What happened after that? My own government made me swear to carry to my grave. But some oaths need to be broken. This is the true story of me and women like me, the forgotten soldiers. Catherine sits down on the attic floor, heart pounding against her ribs, and begins to read the story her grandmother kept secret for 60 years. The story begins in the spring of 1942 in this very farmhouse. Eleanor Harrison, called Ellie by everyone who loved her, was 25 years old that spring. She stood on the front porch watching her father, Thomas Harrison, repair the fence along the western field. He walked with a slight limp from the wound he'd carried home from Belleau Wood in 1918, but he never complained. The Harrisons were like that. They served, they endured, and they never made a fuss about it. Ellie was the youngest child in a family with deep military roots running back generations. Her grandfather fought in the Civil War, her father in the First World War, and now her two older brothers, Robert and William, had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. Robert shipped out to the Pacific, William to England. Every week, Ellie and her father waited for letters from the front with a quiet anxiety that neither ever spoke aloud. The journal described her this way: chestnut brown hair usually tied back in a practical knot, gray blue eyes inherited from her father, a slender frame made strong by years of farm work. She had been the top student at Amarillo High School, offered a scholarship to the University of Texas, but she turned it down to stay home and help after her mother died of tuberculosis in 1938. Her mother, Margaret, a small woman with a warm smile, had taught Ellie that true strength lives not in muscle but in will. You can do anything you set your mind to, her mother said during those final days. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. The old radio in the living room became the center of every evening. Ellie and her father sat together listening to news from the war in Europe. The deep voice of the broadcaster filled the room, describing battles, occupied cities, casualty figures. Every night, Ellie felt trapped in this farmhouse while the whole world burned. One March evening, after the radio fell silent, Thomas looked at his daughter with knowing eyes. You want to go? It was not a question, it was an acknowledgement. Ellie did not deny it. They are recruiting women for the Women's Army Corps, Father. I can help. I know how to fix machinery from all those years working with Robert in the barn. I know Morse code from working with Uncle Earl's radio station in Dallas. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window where darkness was swallowing the fields. Finally, he spoke. I have seen war, Ellie. It is not what they write about in newspapers. I know, Father. No, you do not know. Thomas turned back to his daughter, his eyes heavy with memories. I have seen things I cannot tell anyone, things I carry in my sleep every night. But, he paused, drawing a deep breath, but if you have decided, I will not stop you. The Harrisons have always served when their country needed them. He walked to her side and placed his calloused hands on her shoulders. Only promise me one thing, Ellie. Promise me you will come home. No matter what happens, no matter what you face, you must come back to this house. Promise me. Ellie looked into her father's eyes and saw the fear he tried to hide, the love he did not know how to express, the faith he placed in her. I promise, Father. I will come home. That promise would become the thread holding her together through the darkest nights ahead, when everything else had been stripped away. And if you are captured, you will be protected by the Geneva Convention like any other soldier. Ellie quickly distinguished herself in training. Her skills with radio equipment surpassed most other recruits. She could receive and transmit Morse code at 25 words per minute, faster than some instructors. Major Blackwell noted in her report, Harrison has the mind of an engineer and the composure of a surgeon. Recommend assignment to Frontline Communications Unit. Here, Ellie also found the friends who would walk through hell beside her. Dorothy Kowalski, called Dot, was 28, Polish-American from Chicago, a nurse with skilled hands and a compassionate heart. Her parents immigrated from Warsaw in 19 opening a small bakery in the Polish neighborhood of Chicago. Dot had dark, shiny hair and an easy smile, but behind her warmth lay a toughness forged through years working in a city hospital, where she witnessed things ordinary people could not imagine. Frances Chen, called Frankie, was 24, Chinese-American from San Francisco. A cryptography specialist, one of the few women trained in that field. Her grandfather worked on the railroads, facing discrimination and beatings, yet still built a successful family. Frankie inherited his sharp intelligence and infinite patience. She could look at a string of numbers and see patterns that others missed entirely. Betty Jean Morrison was 22 from Atlanta, Georgia, an administrative secretary, the youngest of the group. Betty Jean had golden hair, bright blue eyes, and the innocent appearance of a pampered Southern belle. But beneath that delicate exterior lay a determination few ever saw. She joined the WWII to prove to her father, a conservative senator, that women could do more than organize tea parties and bear children. 4 women from 4 corners of America, with different stories and different dreams, but sharing a common purpose. They did not know that fate was weaving them together, preparing them for a trial that no training could ever prepare them for. During a session on prisoner conduct, an instructor stood before the class holding a small book. These are the rules of the Geneva Convention. If you are captured, you provide only name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. You have the right to humane treatment, medical care, and communication with your families through the Red Cross. This is international law, and all parties to this war must follow it. Ellie took careful notes on every point, placing complete faith in this international legal system. She did not know that these rules would not apply to her and women like her. That somewhere in Germany, special plans were already being drawn up for exactly such women who dared to wear uniforms. Autumn of 1943 brought Ellie and her unit to Italy, stationed at a small communications base about 15 miles south of Monte Cassino. This was a zone of fierce fighting, where Allied forces struggled to push back German defenses on the road to Rome. Ellie's job was coordinating communications between frontline units and command headquarters. Every day, she sat at her radio equipment, headphones pressed to her ears, hands scribbling rapid notes of Morse code messages from across the front. Artillery coordinates, movement orders, casualty reports. Through her headphones, she heard the heartbeat of war. Their base was an old Italian villa, once the summer home of an aristocratic family, now converted into a communications center. Thick stone walls provided good insulation against the winter cold. Tall windows looked out over a valley where smoke sometimes rose from distant battles. Night after night, the rumble of distant artillery rolled across the hills like summer thunder back in Texas. Ellie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about her father in Amarillo, about her promise. She wrote letters home every week, telling what she was allowed to tell, hiding the fear that sometimes crept into her dreams. January 1944 arrived with bone-cutting cold. News from the front was not encouraging. German forces were strengthening their defenses, and the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. Tension seeped into every conversation, every meal, every shift. And then, on a night late in January, everything changed. Ellie was working the night shift, headphones on, handwriting rapidly a string of messages from a frontline unit. Outside the window, darkness covered the valley. Everything seemed unusually quiet. Suddenly, alarm sirens tore through the night. Red lights flashed throughout the base. Shouts erupted from all directions. German tanks. They have broken through the line! Ellie ripped off her headphones, heart hammering. Through the window, she saw explosions lighting up the northern sky, growing closer. The roar of tank engines rumbled like monsters awakening from sleep. Major Henderson, the base commander, burst into the communications room. Evacuate. Everyone evacuate south. Burn all classified documents. In the chaos, Ellie found Dot, Frankie, and Betty Jean. They ran toward the rear exit, heading south toward the evacuation trucks. But the Germans were faster. When they reached the back courtyard, a squad of German soldiers was already waiting, rifles pointed directly at them. Halt! The shout in German cut through the night. Flashlight beams blinded them, so bright they could see nothing else. Ellie raised her hands, heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst from her chest. She looked at her companions. Dot stood beside her, face pale as paper. An agreement between civilized men for other men. He stepped closer to Ellie, close enough that she could smell expensive soap and cigarette tobacco. His gray eyes stared directly into hers, evaluating, analyzing. You are not men, Lieutenant. You are women who have abandoned your natural role to play at being soldiers. That places you in a different category, a category that Geneva does not address. Ellie felt cold run down her spine, and she knew it was not from the January weather. He turned and spoke German to his subordinates. Ellie did not understand the words, but she saw how the soldiers' eyes changed as they looked at her and her companions. No longer the gaze of soldiers viewing captured enemies. Something else. Something that made her want to shrink away. The man turned back, the smile still on his lips. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Colonel Werner Chrysler, SS, and you, ladies, will be my guests for some time. I assure you, this stay will be quite memorable. He gave an order in German, and guards moved forward to bind their hands. As the rough rope tightened around Ellie's wrists, she saw in Chrysler's eyes something she would never forget. Excitement. Not the excitement of a predator before prey. The excitement of a researcher before a new experiment. In that moment, Ellie understood that everything she learned about the Geneva Convention, about prisoner rights, about the protection of international law, all of it meant nothing. She and her companions had stepped into a different world where no rules applied to them. That same night, hundreds of miles to the north, a young British pilot was fighting wind and fog over French skies. Margaret Crawford, called Maggie, was 24 years old, a member of the Air Transport Auxiliary, the unit of women pilots who ferried aircraft from factories to frontline bases. Tonight, she was flying a Spitfire from an English factory to a base near Paris. Maggie was the daughter of an impoverished earl in Yorkshire, an aristocratic family fallen on hard times after the First World War. Her father died at the Somme when she was only 4, leaving her mother with a crumbling castle and a mountain of debt. Maggie grew up under society's expectations for a proper young lady. Learn piano, learn to pour tea, learn to smile blandly at parties. She hated every bit of it. At 16, Maggie convinced an old pilot in the village to teach her to fly. He was a veteran of the First World War, a lonely man with distant eyes and burned scars on his face. He taught her everything he knew, and when he died the year Maggie turned 20, she was a better pilot than most men. When the ATA began recruiting women pilots, Maggie was among the first to apply. Her mother wept, saying her daughter was ruining the family's reputation. Maggie did not care. For the first time in her life, she was doing what she loved and being paid for it. But tonight, everything went wrong. She was crossing French airspace when German anti-aircraft guns found her. Explosions burst around her, blinding light tearing through darkness. A shell fragment punched through the left wing, and the Spitfire began spinning out of control. Maggie ejected when the plane was 2,000 feet above ground. She landed safely in an empty field but could not escape. German patrols found her hiding in an abandoned barn just hours later. The commanding officer looked at her RAF uniform with unconcealed contempt. In English rose flying killing machines. He spoke in broken English. How perverted your country has become, sending women into the sky. Maggie stared straight into his eyes, unblinking. Name, rank, and serial number. That is all I will provide. The officer laughed coldly. We shall see how long your stubbornness lasts. And farther south in Lyon, France, another woman was facing similar fate. Colette Moreau was 32, a primary school teacher before the war. She taught children to read, to do arithmetic, to love France. Her life was peaceful and meaningful until German forces crossed the border in 1940. Her husband Pierre, a gentle mechanic, joined the resistance from the very first days. He printed leaflets, hid weapons, helped Jewish families escape. One October night in 1942, the Gestapo came to their home. They dragged Pierre into the courtyard and shot him before Colette's eyes. No trial, no explanation, just 2 gunshots and silence. After Pierre's death, Colette had 2 choices: collapse or keep fighting. She chose the second. She became one of the resistance's most important guides, specializing in helping downed Allied pilots escape to England. In 2 years, she guided more than 30 pilots safely across the Pyrenees. But finally, she was betrayed. An informer in the network, someone she once trusted, sold her to the Gestapo for 100 Reichsmarks. When they came to arrest her, Colette did not run. She stood straight, looked into their eyes, and said nothing. Without uniform, without military rank, Colette was classified as a female terrorist, the worst category in the German system. No rights recognized, no protection granted. 3 women from 3 different nations, an American communications officer from Texas, a British pilot from Yorkshire, a French resistance fighter from Lyon. They had never met, but fate was pulling them toward the same place. And the man waiting for them had prepared everything. To understand what would happen to Ellie and women like her, we must go back 1 year earlier, to the autumn of 1942, at SS headquarters in Berlin. In a windowless conference room under cold fluorescent light, a group of SS officers sat around a long table. On the table lay folders, reports, and photographs of women in Allied uniforms. Colonel Werner Kreisler stood at the head of the table, a man with a notable history. Born in 1899 to an impoverished Prussian aristocratic family, his father was a cavalry officer killed in 1914 during the first weeks of the First World War. His mother was a bitter and strict woman who instilled in her son beliefs about the natural order of gender and the decadence of modern Western society. Kreisler studied psychology at Heidelberg University, then joined the SS in 1933. He quickly gained recognition as someone with special talent for breaking prisoners without relying on ordinary physical violence. He understood human psychology, knew how to find weaknesses and exploit them. In 1942, as Germany began capturing increasing numbers of Allied servicewomen, Kreisler was assigned to develop Protocol 27, a special processing system designed specifically for these prisoners. At that meeting, Kreisler presented his perspective. Western servicewomen maintained psychological resistance through identifying themselves with the soldier role. He spoke in a monotone as if delivering an academic lecture. They believe that by wearing uniforms, they become part of the military system and are protected by its rules from us. He paused, looking around the table. This identification must be systematically dismantled. They must be forced to remember that they are women first, with all that implies about vulnerability. Once their self-perception changes, their resistance will collapse. Another officer asked about specific methods. Kreisler smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. Remove uniforms. Remove dignity. Remove everything that makes them feel like soldiers. Replace it with things that remind them of their gender. And then, he did not need to finish the sentence. The meeting concluded with approval from everyone present. Protocol 27 was authorized. Special facilities were planned. Personnel were selected and trained. One of those selected was Helga Brenner. Brenner, 38 years old, was the product of a childhood filled with violence and hunger. Born to a poor working-class family in Bavaria, she grew up with her alcoholic father's fists and her weak mother's submission. From early on, Brenner learned that the world was cruel, that the strong dominated the weak, and that women must know their place if they wanted to survive. When the Nazi regime rose to power, Brenner found meaning. She joined the party's women's organizations, eventually recruited into the SS. Here, she was no longer a victim. She held power. And those women who dared to wear uniforms, carry weapons, fly aircraft, those women who dared to reject the role Brenner had been forced to accept, they represented everything she hated. They were living proof that she could have had other choices, and that was unforgivable. The truck carrying Ellie and her companions drove through the night, heading east, deeper into German territory. Inside the dark cargo hold, 4 women sat in silence, hands bound, mouths gagged. They did not know where they were going. They only knew they were moving farther from the front lines, farther from hope of rescue. When dawn broke, the truck stopped before a building in isolated countryside. No signs, no flags, no indication that this place existed. Only gray walls, small barred windows, and barbed wire fencing surrounding everything. This was Einrichtung 9, Facility 9, one of 15 secret detention centers built specifically for women prisoners. The gates opened. The truck drove into the courtyard. The rear doors swung open, and morning light flooded in, blinding after so many hours in darkness. "Welcome to your new home," Chrysler's voice rang out, polite as if greeting guests at a party. "Your war is over, but I am afraid your real troubles are only beginning." They were led inside through long corridors with fluorescent lighting and the smell of disinfectant. Finally, they stopped before a large room with concrete walls, tile floor, and harsh bright lights. Waiting for them there was Helga Brenner. She stood straight as an iron rod, her stocky frame filling out the SS uniform, her blonde hair pulled tight behind her head. Her pale blue eyes swept over the 4 women like someone inspecting merchandise. "Strip." The order came in English, cold as steel. "We are military officers," Dot began, "under the Geneva Convention." Brenner slapped her so hard that Dot fell to the floor, blood flowing from her lip. "You are not officers." Brenner spoke, her voice not rising despite the violence she had just committed. "You are women who have forgotten your place. This process will help you remember." She nodded to the guards, both male and female, standing around the room. If they will not undress themselves, help them. What happened next, Ellie would try to erase from memory for the rest of her life, but never succeed. The humiliation was carried out systematically, methodically. They were forced to stand naked under harsh lights while German officers circled them, taking notes, making comments. Cameras flashed repeatedly. For identification purposes, an officer explained with a small smile that Ellie wanted to tear from his face. They were examined in ways no training had prepared them for. Strange hands touched their bodies, violating every boundary. And throughout, Brenner stood watching, noting observations in a small book, evaluating each woman's reactions like a scientist monitoring an experiment. Ellie focused on a crack in the opposite wall. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in, breathe out. She remembered her father's words. "No matter what happens, you must come home." She repeated it in her mind like an incantation. "I must come home. I must come home. I must come home." When it was over, they were taken to a small room and thrown clothing, not uniforms. These were flimsy dresses, too small or too large. No underwear, no proper shoes, only thin slippers. "Look at you now," Brenner said, voice dripping with contempt. "Now you look like women. No more pretending to be soldiers." She stepped close to Ellie, staring directly into her eyes. "You thought the uniform made you a soldier?" Brenner asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a secret. "It was just cloth, and now it is gone. What are you now? What are you?" Ellie looked straight into those cold blue eyes and spoke, voice trembling but not breaking. "First Lieutenant Eleanor Harrison, United States Women's Army Corps, service number A742893. Brenner laughed, a dry sound without any joy. "We shall see how long you remember those numbers." The first night at Facility 9, 4 women lay huddled on the cold tile floor of their cell, no blankets, no pillows, only thin dresses and darkness surrounding them. Dot wept quietly, trying to muffle her sobs. Frankie lay staring at the ceiling without speaking, her face like stone. Betty Jean shivered uncontrollably, her bright blue eyes wide in the darkness. Ellie felt the cold seeping into her bones. She felt the exhaustion from hours of humiliation. She felt fear trying to swallow her from inside. But she also remembered her father's words. "You promised to come home." She crawled to Dot's side, squeezing her hand gently in the darkness. "Listen to me," Ellie whispered, voice hoarse from thirst. "All of you, listen to me." She waited until she felt the others' attention. "We are still soldiers. They took our uniforms, but they cannot take that. Name, rank, serial number. That is what we are." "How can you say that after what just happened?" Dot asked, her voice breaking. "Because if I do not believe it, I will not survive this night," Ellie answered. "And I promised my father I would come home." Silence filled the room. Then in the darkness, Ellie began to whisper. "First Lieutenant Eleanor Harrison, United States Women's Army Corps, service number A742893, Amarillo, Texas." A moment later, Dot's voice rose, trembling but clear. "First Lieutenant Dorothy Kowalski, United States Women's Army Corps, service number B384217, Chicago, Illinois." Then Frankie, First Lieutenant Francis Chen, United States Women's Army Corps, service number C95682, San Francisco, California. And finally, Betty Jean, her voice small as a breath. First Lieutenant Betty Jean Morrison, United States Women's Army Corps, service number D273954, Atlanta, Georgia. Four voices in the darkness, reminding each other who they truly were. A ritual of survival born on the first night of hell. They did not know this ritual would become their most powerful weapon in the months ahead. They did not know that in other rooms of this same facility, other women were finding their own ways to remember who they were. They did not know that this silent solidarity would drive Colonel Chrysler and Helga Brenner to madness trying to break it. They only knew that tonight, in this freezing room, they were still soldiers, and they would keep fighting. Far away at the farmhouse in Amarillo, Thomas Harrison sat beside the old radio, listening to news from the Italian front. He did not know his daughter had been captured. He would not know for many months. But that night, looking up at the star-filled Texas sky, he felt a strange unease in his heart, as if something had changed that he could not name. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for his daughter, as he did every night since she left. "Wherever you are, Ellie, be strong, and remember what you promised me." 3 weeks passed at Facility 9. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. 3 weeks that aged Eleanor Harrison in ways that would never fully heal. By the end of the first week, Ellie began to understand that she and her companions were not the only victims in this place. Facility 9 held approximately 60 women from multiple nations: Americans, British, French, Polish, even some Dutch and Norwegian. All shared one thing in common. They had all been soldiers or resistance fighters. They had all dared to step outside the roles that men like Chrysler believed women should occupy. The facility operated with German precision. Every horror had a schedule. Every cruelty followed a procedure. There were forms to fill out, rooms designated for specific purposes, files maintained on every prisoner. This was not random brutality. This was science. Margaret Crawford arrived at the same facility 2 weeks after Ellie. When the British pilot was marched into the holding area, Ellie recognized immediately that her RAF uniform had been replaced by the same flimsy dress that all the women wore. Maggie's blonde hair, once neatly trimmed, hung limp and unwashed. But her blue eyes still held defiance. "Pilot?" Ellie asked quietly when they were placed beside each other during the meager evening meal. "ATA, ferried Spitfires," Maggie answered in clipped tones. "You?" "Whack, Communications." They exchanged a look that needed no words. An understanding passed between them, soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor. Through careful observation, Ellie mapped the facility in her mind, since paper and pencil were forbidden. Section A held the communal cells where prisoners slept and ate. Section B contained the processing rooms where new arrivals were stripped of dignity upon arrival. Section C housed standard interrogation chambers where questions about military information were asked. Section D was reserved for what they called special interrogation. No one spoke about what happened there. Section E contained Chrysler's office and the research team's workspace. The most terrifying aspect was not the cruelty itself, but how organized it all was. Every action was documented. Every response was recorded. Every breakdown was analyzed. The Germans were not merely holding these women. They were studying them. One morning, 4 weeks into her captivity, Ellie was summoned to Chrysler's office. It was the first time since their initial encounter that she faced him alone in a space that resembled civilization. The office had books lining the walls, a heavy oak desk, windows overlooking a garden. Almost normal, almost civilized. The contrast with her daily reality made it all the more disturbing. Chrysler sat behind the desk reading a file. Her file, Ellie realized. He did not look up as she was led in by guards and made to stand before him. Lieutenant Harrison. He spoke without raising his eyes. Daughter of Thomas Harrison, veteran of Belleau Wood, 2 brothers currently serving, Robert in the Pacific, William in England. An impressive military tradition in your family. Ellie said nothing. Her heart pounded against her ribs. You are intelligent. Chrysler continued, finally looking up. High marks in training, proficient in radio technology, mastery of Morse code. You could be useful. I will provide only name, rank, and serial number. Chrysler smiled. That smile that never reached his cold, gray eyes. I do not need military information from you, Lieutenant. Whatever you knew is long outdated. He rose from behind the desk and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the garden as if contemplating the weather. Do you know why you are here? Not because of what you know, because of what you represent. I do not understand. Chrysler turned back, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. You are a phenomenon, Lieutenant Harrison. A woman who voluntarily abandoned her natural role to become a soldier. What drives such a woman? What sustains her strength? And most importantly, what will break her? Ellie felt nausea rising in her throat. They were not just being held prisoner. They were being studied, examined like laboratory rats in some twisted experiment. We are writing the future here, Chrysler said, his voice taking on an almost academic tone. And so she hated them with the particular fury reserved for those who remind us of our own lost possibilities. She would patrol the corridors at night, boots echoing on concrete floors, stopping at random cells to conduct inspections that served no purpose except terror. She kept detailed records on every prisoner, noting which techniques produced the strongest reactions, which women cried, which ones retreated into silence, which ones still showed defiance. The woman in charge of our section would tell us daily that we deserved everything that happened. Maggie later wrote in her hidden journal, she said real women stayed home and had babies for their country, that by putting on uniforms, we had chosen to be treated like men, or worse than men. She would help hold us down during interrogations. She would watch and take notes. Sometimes she seemed to enjoy it more than the male officers did. But something unexpected happened in that place of calculated cruelty. Something the Germans had not planned for. The women began to resist, not with weapons, not with escape attempts. They resisted by refusing to forget who they were. The nighttime ritual that Ellie started on her first night spread through the facility like a whispered flame. Every evening after lights out, voices would rise in the darkness. Soft as breath, barely audible, but present. Name, rank, serial number, hometown, a chain of identity passing from cell to cell, a reminder that they were more than what their captors tried to make them. Ellie would begin in her cell. First Lieutenant Eleanor Harrison, United States Women's Army Corps. Service number A742893, Amarillo, Texas. Dot would follow, then Frankie, then Betty Jean, and in the cells beyond, other voices join. British accents, French accents, Polish accents, 60 women in the darkness, reciting who they were, refusing to become what Chrysler wanted them to become. Colette Moreau arrived at the facility in March 1944. The French resistance fighter had endured weeks of interrogation by the Gestapo before being transferred. She could barely walk when they brought her in, but that first night, when she heard the whispered ritual passing through the walls, she added her voice. Colette Moreau, Résistance Française, Lyon. No rank, no serial number. She had none, but she had her name and her cause, and that was enough. The women developed other forms of resistance as well. Frankie Chen, with her cryptographer's mind, created a system of signals using coughs and taps to communicate when guards were not listening. One cough meant warning, guards approaching. 2 coughs meant safe to talk. Tapping patterns based on Morse code carried messages through walls. It was primitive but effective. They cared for each other in small ways that defied the isolation the Germans tried to impose. When someone returned from interrogation unable to walk, others would help clean her wounds with their meager water rations. When someone could not stop crying, others would hold her in the darkness. When someone wanted to give up, others would whisper reasons to keep living. They could take our clothes, our privacy, even our names. Maggie wrote in a journal she kept hidden in a crack in the wall, but they could not take who we really were. Each night we whispered our ranks and units to each other. We reminded ourselves we are soldiers. This is just another battlefield. The Germans noticed this solidarity and it infuriated them. Chrysler had expected Western women to break quickly under the specialized techniques of Protocol 27. When they did not, when they continued to show resistance despite everything done to them, he became obsessed with understanding why. He ordered changes in approach. Prisoners who seemed to be leaders were isolated from others. Extra rations were offered to those who would inform on their companions. Privileges were promised to those who cooperated fully. These tactics rarely worked. Chrysler documented his frustration in reports that would be discovered decades later. Subject 17, American, continues to show remarkable resilience despite 3 weeks of intensive processing. She maintains contact with other prisoners through unknown means. Source of psychological strength unclear. Recommend increased isolation and specialized night sessions. Subject 17 was Ellie. Every woman in the facility would become leverage against every other. The bonds they had built would become weapons against them. But Betty Jean was 22 years old. She was trembling so hard she could barely stand. Ellie looked at Dot, at Frankie, at Betty Jean herself. Do not. Colette's voice came from the corner of the cell, quiet but firm. The French woman had been watching with dark eyes. If you give them anything tonight, they will do this to all of us forever, every night. She knows this. We all know this. Betty Jean met Ellie's eyes. For a moment, the trembling stopped. The young woman from Atlanta, the senator's daughter who had joined the WWII to prove something, nodded almost imperceptibly. Name, rank, and serial number. Betty Jean whispered, "That is all I will give." Brenner's smile widened. "We shall see." They took her. That night was the longest of Ellie's life. She sat in the darkness, listening to sounds that came from somewhere in the building. Sounds she would never be able to forget. Sounds that would echo in her nightmares for the rest of her days. Dot wept openly, no longer trying to muffle her sobs. Frankie sat motionless, her face carved from stone, but tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Colette prayed in French, words Ellie did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. Ellie did not sleep. She did not pray. She sat with her back against the cold wall, counting the hours until dawn, hating herself for not being able to do anything, hating the choice she had been forced to make, hating the men who had constructed this hell. When the first gray light of morning crept through the small window, the cell door opened. Guards threw Betty Jean inside like discarding garbage. She could not stand. She could not speak. Her dress was torn. Her eyes were open, but seemed to see nothing. The other women moved immediately, gathering around her, lifting her gently, using their bodies to shield her from the cold floor. In December 1944, as the Allied forces pushed closer to German borders, Chrysler was summoned to Berlin to report on the program's results. The meeting took place at SS headquarters. Officers from all 15 facilities holding women prisoners presented their findings to the highest levels of command. Heinrich Himmler himself presided. "Report from Facility 9, Himmler asked, his small eyes scanning the assembled officers behind round spectacles. Chrysler stood. "Results are complex, Reichsfuhrer. Our methods are effective in producing short-term psychological breakdown. However, I must report an unexpected phenomenon." "What phenomenon?" "Solidarity. They form tight bonds, supporting each other in ways we did not anticipate. Some women show endurance capacity far exceeding our expectations for their gender." Another officer interjected, "Facility 3 has different results. We find Soviet women pilots nearly impossible to break using standard methods, while British and American women respond more strongly to factors involving honor and morality." Himmler nodded slowly. "Adjust methods according to individual psychological profile rather than nationality. Continue research. This data will be valuable for the Reich's future." The meeting continued for hours. Officers debating techniques and results with the detached language of academics discussing laboratory findings. Not once did anyone acknowledge that they were discussing human beings. Not once did anyone question whether what they were doing was monstrous. The minutes of this meeting, discovered decades later in East German archives, would become crucial evidence of how systematic and deliberate the program had been. This was not the work of a few rogue officers. This was policy, approved at the highest levels, implemented across multiple facilities, documented with bureaucratic precision. As 1945 began, everything changed. The war was turning against Germany. Allied forces advanced from the west and east. The sound of distant artillery grew closer week by week. The guards became nervous, their cruelty mixed now with fear of what would happen when the Allies arrived. Ellie noticed subtle changes, fewer supplies, more tension among the staff, officers disappearing without explanation, and most telling of all, the burning of documents. Night after night, she saw smoke rising from behind the administrative building, boxes of files being carried out, the smell of burning paper drifting across the compound. They are destroying evidence, Maggie whispered one evening during their brief exercise period. They know what is coming. In March 1945, Chrysler summoned Ellie to his office one final time. He looked different, older. The confident professor she first met had become a hunted man. His uniform was less immaculate. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The war is ending. The war is, he said, his voice still carrying that academic detachment, as if discussing someone else's failure. Not in the way we hoped. Ellie stood before him, 15 months of captivity having stripped 30 pounds from her frame and left streaks of white in her hair. But she stood straight. You survived, Chrysler observed. Impressive. 15 months here, and you are not broken. Ellie said nothing. You won, Lieutenant Harrison. You did not break. He tilted his head, studying her one last time. I confess, I still do not fully understand how. Perhaps that will be my one unfinished research question. He rose from behind the desk. I must go now. There are arrangements to be made. That was the last time Ellie saw Werner Chrysler. He vanished into the chaos of Germany's final weeks, his fate unknown. In the days that followed, Ellie watched the systematic destruction of everything that could prove what had happened at Facility 9. Guards carried out box after box of files and fed them to bonfires that burned day and night. The research notes, the prisoner evaluations, the photographs, the detailed records of Protocol 27. All of it turning to ash. Brenner was among the last to leave. On her final night, she walked through the cell blocks one more time. She stopped at Ellie's cell, looking through the bars at the women huddled inside. You think you will tell the world what happened here? Brenner laughed. No one will believe you, and even if they do, they will not want to hear it. Your own people will want to forget. Trust me, this story will never be told. She threw a set of keys onto the floor outside the cell and walked away into the night. The keys to their cells, just like that, as if they were no longer worth the trouble of guarding. April 15, 1945. The sound of artillery had been growing closer for days. Then came the rumble of vehicles. Engines not German. The sharp crack of small arms fire. Shouts in English. American English. The women pressed against the windows of their cells, hearts pounding, afraid to hope, afraid not to hope. Then the doors burst open. Light flooded in. And standing in the doorway was an American soldier, young, maybe 22, with wide eyes taking in the scene before him. His uniform bore the insignia of the Third Army. His rifle hung forgotten at his side. U.S. Army, he shouted over his shoulder. We got prisoners. We got... His voice faltered as he looked at them. Women, we got American women. Ellie stepped forward on legs that trembled with weakness and emotion. She weighed perhaps 85 pounds. Her hair had turned white at the temples, though she was only 26. Her dress hung from her skeletal frame like a rag on a scarecrow. But she stood straight. She looked that young soldier in the eye. We are WWII, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse but clear. We are soldiers, like you. The soldier, whose name was James Novak and who came from Cleveland, Ohio, would later write in his report, I have seen many terrible things in this war, but nothing compared to that moment. Those women, thin as ghosts, standing there telling me they were soldiers. I cried. I am not ashamed to admit it. I cried like a baby. More soldiers poured in behind him. Medics with stretchers, officers shouting orders, chaos of liberation. Maggie Crawford was carried out on a stretcher, too weak to walk. Colette Moreau leaned on the shoulder of a young private, tears streaming down her face for the first time since her husband's death. Betty Jean Morrison had to be lifted and carried, her legs unable to support her. Ellie walked out on her own 2 feet, slowly, painfully, but under her own power. Outside, she stopped and turned back to look at the building that had been her prison for 15 months. Smoke still rose from behind it, where documents continued to burn. The gray walls, the barred windows, the barbed wire. All the records, Ellie said to Maggie, who was being loaded into a medical truck nearby. They burned everything. Maggie turned her head, meeting Ellie's eyes. We still have our memories. They cannot burn that. But neither woman knew that their memories would soon be ordered sealed, that the second betrayal was coming, that the country they served would ask them to keep silent about everything they had endured. The trucks began to move, carrying the liberated prisoners toward field hospitals behind Allied lines. Ellie sat in the back of a covered vehicle, surrounded by other survivors, watching through a gap in the canvas as Facility 9 grew smaller and finally disappeared. She thought about her father in Amarillo, who still did not know if she was alive or dead. She thought about the promise she made. I will come home. She was going home, but she was not the same woman who left, and she was beginning to understand that home might not be the same place either. The truck rumbled on through the German countryside, passing burned-out tanks and bombed villages and endless lines of refugees. The war was ending. Liberation had come. But for Eleanor Harrison and the women like her, a different kind of prison was waiting. The joy of liberation lasted less than a week. Eleanor Harrison and the other women survivors were transported to a special military hospital in Frankfurt, separate from the facilities treating male prisoners of war. No photographers came to document their liberation. No newspaper reporters requested interviews. No newsreel cameras captured their faces for audiences back home. Instead, they were placed in a secluded wing of the hospital, guarded not by German soldiers now, but by American military police. For their protection, they were told, for their privacy. Ellie lay in a clean hospital bed for the first time in 15 months. White sheets, a real pillow. Nurses who spoke English and treated her wounds with gentle hands. She should have felt safe. She should have felt free, but something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the nurses avoided certain questions, in the way officers looked at her and then looked away, in the whispered conversations that stopped whenever a patient came near. On the 5th day after liberation, a military intelligence officer came to see her. His name was Major Robert Caldwell. He was perhaps 40 years old, with tired eyes and a folder tucked under his arm. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down with the weary posture of a man who had done this many times before. Lieutenant Harrison. He began, his voice carefully neutral. I need to conduct a debriefing regarding your time in German captivity. Everything you tell me will be documented for official records. Ellie told him everything. Every detail she could remember about Facility 9. The systematic processing upon arrival. The research conducted by Chrysler. The role of Helga Brenner. The night interrogations. The burning of documents before liberation. She spoke for hours, believing that her testimony would be used to bring the perpetrators to justice, that the world would learn what had been done to her and women like her. When she finished, Caldwell sat in silence for a long moment. Then he reached into his folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. Sign these. Ellie looked at the documents. What are they? Caldwell's eyes finally met hers, and she saw something there that made her stomach drop. Regret, or perhaps shame. Security agreements. What you have told me today is being classified for reasons of national security. You are not to discuss your experiences with anyone, not family, not friends, not doctors, not journalists. No one. Ellie stared at him, certain she had misheard. National security? I just told you about war crimes committed against American servicewomen. Caldwell's jaw tightened. I do not make these decisions, Lieutenant. I just carry them out. But I can tell you this much. If you sign, you receive an honorable discharge and transport home. If you refuse... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ellie looked down at her hands, thin, scarred, trembling slightly. Hands that had operated radio equipment, that had been bound with rope, that had held Betty Jean Morrison through the worst night of her life. "What about Werner Chrysler?" she asked. "What about Helga Brenner? Will they be prosecuted?" Caldwell would not meet her eyes. "I have no information about specific individuals." In that moment, Ellie understood everything. There would be no trials, no justice, no acknowledgement of what had happened. The women of Facility 9 were an embarrassment, a complication, a story that did not fit the narrative of glorious victory. She signed the papers. They all did. Maggie Crawford signed in her hospital bed, hands still weak from malnutrition. Colette Moreau signed, her dark eyes empty of the fire that once burned there. Betty Jean Morrison signed with a hand that shook so badly the signature was barely legible. Dorothy Kowalski signed while silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Frances Chen signed with the same calm precision she brought to everything, though something behind her eyes had died. 60 women signed away their right to tell the truth about what had been done to them. A classified memo dated May 1945, discovered only in 2001, explained the reasoning. Detailed accounts of specialized enemy treatment of female military personnel could cause serious public relations issues and negatively impact future recruitment of women for military service. These experiences, while regrettable, do not serve current intelligence purposes and should be sealed indefinitely. The psychological well-being of the subjects will be better served by encouraging them to move forward rather than dwelling on past trauma. In simpler words, what happened to these women would make the public angry and might discourage other women from joining the military. So their stories needed to disappear. A separate British memo from 1947, not declassified until 2010, was even more direct. References to specialized enemy treatment of female personnel must be removed from all public records. Such information serves no historical purpose and could damage public morale and international relations in the post-war period. Former prisoners should be counseled to focus on reintegration into civilian life. The women who had endured the worst were to receive the least recognition. Their courage was to be erased. Their suffering was to be forgotten. July 1945, Amarillo, Texas. Ellie stood on the front porch of the farmhouse, looking out at the wheat fields golden under the summer sun. The same view she had memorized before leaving 3 years ago. The same house, the same land, but nothing was the same. Her father Thomas had aged 20 years in her absence. His hair had gone completely white. His limp was more pronounced. When he saw her step off the bus in town, he had wept openly, something she had never seen him do before. He did not ask questions about what happened. Perhaps he sensed that she could not answer. Perhaps he understood, from his own war, that some things cannot be spoken. He simply held her and said, "You kept your promise. You came home." But Ellie knew she had not really come home. Not all of her. Some part of Eleanor Harrison was still in Facility 9, would always be in Facility 9, locked in that cold cell with the whispered names echoing in the darkness. The nightmares came every night. She would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, certain that Helga Brenner was standing over her bed, certain that she was back in that room with the harsh lights and the cameras and the hands that would not stop. Thomas would come to her room and sit beside her bed, just as he did when she was a child afraid of thunderstorms. He would not speak. He would simply be there, a solid presence in the darkness. "I used to have nights like this," he said one evening, his voice soft. "After Belleau Wood, the things I saw there. I never told anyone." "Did you want to tell?" Ellie asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes, but who would understand? Who would want to hear?" Ellie felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I want to tell, Father, but I am not allowed. They made me sign papers." Thomas took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her thin fingers. "Some burdens we carry alone, Ellie. Not because we choose to, but because the world is not ready to share them. But know this, I see you, I see what you carry, even if I do not know the details. And I am proud of you. Whatever happened, whatever you endured, you survived. You came home. That is all that matters to me. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something." The years after the war passed in a blur of attempted normalcy. Ellie tried to rebuild her life. She took a job at a local radio station, using the skills she had learned in the WWII. She met a man named Daniel, a petroleum engineer with kind eyes and a gentle manner. They married in 1948. The marriage lasted 3 years. Daniel was patient, he was understanding. But there were things he could not comprehend. Why his wife flinched at unexpected touch. Why she could not bear to be in dark rooms. Why she woke screaming from nightmares she would not explain. "I want to help you," he said during their final argument. "But you will not let me in. You will not tell me what happened to you over there." "I cannot." Ellie replied, "I am not allowed. That is not a marriage, Ellie. That is two strangers sharing a house." He was not wrong, but he was not right either. The truth was more complicated than allowed or not allowed. Even if she could speak, would the words come? Could she describe the processing room, the night sessions, Brenner's pale eyes, Chrysler's clinical smile? Could she make anyone understand who had not been there? The divorce was quiet. Daniel remarried 2 years later, had children, lived what appeared to be a happy life. Ellie did not begrudge him. She had given him nothing to hold on to. She never remarried. Ellie stayed in contact with some of the women from Facility 9, though communication was difficult. They had all signed the same papers. They all carried the same secrets. Their letters spoke in code, references that only they could understand, asking after health and families, while the real questions went unasked and unanswered. Maggie Crawford returned to England and married an RAF pilot named Charles in 1947. She never had children. "I could not bear intimacy for years." She wrote to Ellie in 1952. "Charles is patient, but I know he does not understand. How could he?" Colette Moreau stayed in France, returning to teaching, never speaking of the war. She died of cancer in 1967, carrying her secrets to the grave. Dorothy Kowalski became a civilian nurse in Chicago, spending her life caring for others, perhaps because she did not know how to care for herself. She never married. Frances Chen returned to San Francisco, worked for a bank, lived a quiet, solitary life. In 1962, Ellie was reading a magazine article about German scientists recruited by the United States after the war. Operation Paperclip, it was called. Experts in rocketry, aviation, medicine brought to America to work for the government that had defeated them. One name made her blood freeze. Dr. Werner Chrysler, psychology specialist, currently consulting for the Department of Defense on advanced interrogation methodology. He was here, in America, working for her own government. The man who had designed Protocol 27. The man who had studied her like a laboratory specimen. The man whose research notes had documented exactly how to break women. He had escaped justice entirely. More than escaped. He had been rewarded. Ellie wrote letters to senators, to the Department of Defense, to the FBI, to anyone she could think of. She received no responses. Finally, a phone call came. An unnamed official with a cold voice. "Lieutenant Harrison, I advise you to cease your inquiries. Dr. Chrysler provides valuable services to national security. And may I remind you that you signed a confidentiality agreement regarding your wartime experiences. I trust you have not violated that agreement." The threat was clear. If she continued to pursue Chrysler, her own secrets might be used against her. Somehow. That night, Ellie sat alone in the farmhouse. Thomas had died in 1958, and she had inherited the property. She sat in the darkness of the living room, looking at the old radio that still sat in the corner, and thought about the service pistol her father had left her. She thought about it for a long time, but then she remembered something. The voices in the darkness at Facility 9. 60 women whispering their names, their ranks, their hometowns, refusing to forget, refusing to let the Germans define who they were. They could take everything from us, but they could not take who we were. Ellie put the pistol away. Instead, she began to write, not for publication, not to show anyone, just to record, to remember, to ensure that somewhere, somehow, the truth existed. "If I cannot speak," she wrote, "I will write, and someday when I am gone, someone will find these words. Someone will know." The decades passed. Ellie lived quietly in Amarillo, volunteering at the Veterans Hospital, helping men who came home from Korea and later Vietnam with wounds that no one could see. She understood them in ways their own families could not. She continued writing. Hundreds of pages filled notebooks that she hid in the attic, behind a loose floorboard where no one would find them until she was gone. In 1988, a history professor named Helen Richards began researching women prisoners of the Second World War. She found Ellie's name in partially declassified military records and made contact. For the first time in 40 years, Ellie told her story to someone outside the small circle of survivors. "Why now?" Richards asked. "Because I am going to die," Ellie replied, her voice matter of fact. "The doctors give me a few more years at most, and someone needs to know the truth before it dies with me." The interview lasted 3 days. Richards recorded everything, transcribing Ellie's words with trembling hands as the full scope of what happened at Facility 9 became clear. "This is," Richards struggled to find words. "This is a war crime. This should have been prosecuted at Nuremberg." "It should have been many things," Ellie said, "but it was not. We were an inconvenience, an embarrassment. Easier to forget us than to explain us." The breakthrough came in '95. After the Cold War ended, a cache of documents was discovered in former East German archives. Soviet forces had captured records from several SS facilities before the Germans could destroy them completely. For 50 years, these documents had sat in storage, untranslated and unexamined. Among them were training manuals for Protocol 27, personnel files for Helga Brenner, who had died in 1971 in Argentina under an assumed name, never facing justice, and most importantly, Werner Kreisler's research reports, documenting in clinical detail the methods used against women prisoners. Kreisler himself had died in 1987, living comfortably in Virginia on a government pension. He spent his final years consulting for intelligence agencies, teaching them the techniques he had perfected at Facility 9. He never faced a single charge. He never acknowledged any wrongdoing. He died in his sleep at the age of 88, surrounded by family, believing himself a man of science who had served his country, both of his countries. Professor Richards published her book in 1997, The Forgotten Soldiers, Women Prisoners of World War II and the Silence Imposed Upon Them. It caused a minor sensation in academic circles, but barely registered with the general public. The story was too old, too uncomfortable, too complicated for easy consumption, but it was enough to force a small acknowledgement. In 2001, the United States government held a quiet ceremony. No press was invited, no public announcement was made. Just a small gathering in a nondescript room in Washington where surviving women from the secret facilities were finally, officially recognized. Ellie was 82 years old. She sat in a wheelchair, her body failing, but her mind still sharp. Beside her sat Maggie Crawford, also 82, who had flown from England for this moment. They held hands like they had in the darkness of Facility 9, 57 years ago. There were only 8 survivors left. 8 women out of the hundreds who had passed through the 15 facilities. 8 witnesses to a crime that had almost been erased from history. A general presented them with medals, Purple Hearts, long overdue, certificates of recognition, official apologies couched in careful bureaucratic language that acknowledged wrongdoing without admitting liability. When it was Ellie's turn to speak, she rose slowly from her wheelchair. Maggie helped steady her. The room fell silent. "For 50 years we were told to be silent," Ellie said, her voice thin but clear. "They said it was for national security, but the truth is they were ashamed. Not of what the enemy did to us. They were ashamed that they did not protect us. And then they were ashamed that they made us disappear." She paused, gathering strength. "We were soldiers. We served our country. And when we needed our country most, it turned its back on us. It told us to forget. It told us our suffering did not matter. It told us to be quiet and grateful that we survived." Her eyes swept the room, meeting each face. "We are not grateful. We are not quiet. We are angry. And we have every right to be. But more than anger, we have pride. Because they did not break us. Not the Germans with their protocols and their experiments. Not our own government with its silence and its secrets. We survived. We remembered who we were. And now, finally, the world knows too." She sat back down. The room was silent for a long moment. Then slowly everyone rose to their feet in applause. Maggie leaned close to Ellie. "We did it," she whispered. "We lived long enough to see this day." Ellie squeezed her hand. "It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something." Ellie died in 2006, 90 years old in the farmhouse where she was born. She passed in her sleep, peacefully, her face serene. She left behind the tin box in the attic, the journal, the letters, the complete truth that she had been forbidden to speak for 60 years, and she left instructions for her granddaughter Catherine. Now you can tell the full story. I kept my promise to my father. I came home, and now I can finally rest. Catherine Harrison Mitchell sat in the attic of the Amarillo farmhouse, the journal in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Outside, the autumn sun was setting, painting the wheat fields gold and amber, the same colors her grandmother had seen from this window for 90 years. She had finished reading. Every page, every word. The full account of what Eleanor Harrison and women like her had endured in the decades of enforced silence that followed. The final entry was dated just weeks before Ellie's death. If someone is reading these words, I want them to know one thing. We won. Not because we were liberated, not because the truth was finally told. We won because in the darkest nights, when they tried to take everything from us, we still whispered our names to each other. We still remembered who we were. They could take our uniforms, our dignity, our health, our voices, but they could never, ever take this. We were soldiers. First Lieutenant Eleanor Harrison, United States Women's Army Corps, service number A742893, Amarillo, Texas. I served. I survived. I came home. Catherine closed the journal gently. She understood now why her grandmother had been so quiet, so distant at times, so reluctant to speak of the past. She understood the weight that had been carried in silence for 6 decades, and she understood what she needed to do. She gathered the journal, the letters, the photographs, the medal. She would ensure that Eleanor Harrison's story and the stories of all the forgotten soldiers would never be silenced again. In memory of the women of the Women's Army Corps, Air Transport Auxiliary, and French Resistance who served in World War II. For those who survived captivity only to be silenced. For those whose stories remained classified until death. For Eleanor, Margaret, Colette, Dorothy, Frances, Betty Jean, and hundreds like them whose courage continued long after the war ended. May their sacrifice finally be acknowledged. 1943 to 2025. From darkness into history.